Here is Van Dieman's Firetail Finch. Now, to be honest, that name itself really made me say, I got to see this bird. And I went and Googled it, and it's it's a pretty cool looking bird. Now, this is the kind of red that reminds me of a sun bleached old fire engine. The writing sample is lighter than the swatch. And since the swatch looks much more like a standard red, I think that the sun bleached fire engine is a better look for this ink. Now, despite being a more faded red ink, there is no tone shift as paper change, and while it does shade, it isn't very often. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs just okay. It can be a little aggressive getting deep into the page, but it doesn't feather. And I don't know that I would really recommend this to the student note taker because of the aggression and the more bleached red tone of a fire engine. Just for that reason, but I do think this is beautiful. Now, this is not a red that I would generally go for, but something was really enjoyable about it. And I would absolutely love a bottle of this, even though I normally wouldn't go for this type of red.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Sun bleached fire engine. That is what I see here. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade. You see it in almost without a problem, where the AL is a bit darker than the MOS. The T at the end does get quite a bit darker. Contradiction on the first line has a lighter tone for contra, but the cross of the T gets very dark. The D gets quite a bit darker, where the IC are a nice mid-tone into the TION at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Hanging Lake. Here is Van Dieman's Tasmanian Robin Pink. Here is Van Dieman's Morning Frost, a shimmering ink.
Here is Van Dieman's Devil's Black.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine, though it is still there. If you look at crashing, you can see that the C is a little bit darker than the RAS, and the H gets quite a bit darker to a nice mid-tone IN, darker G at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we have no real problem for bleeding or ghosting. We do have a number of spots that I just don't think are as standout on the camera. They're there. It's not a problem. I doubt they're really going to stop someone from writing on the back of the page, but they are present.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, really telling me that this is very opaque as an ink. Even though we get that faded red look, not anything being affected by the tone of the paper. Super in how it looks. Again, this tone, it just really speaks to me in this one. Doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. You can find it without any kind of a real problem. Easiest probably is like have supposed here on the fourth line, where the H starts much darker than the AVE at the end, but supposed starts lighter with the SU, much darker PP in the middle, OSED lighter at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting, and only a couple of spots that it did get a little bit deeper into the page. In no way would this stop anybody from writing on the back of the page with this ink. It's just that I've noticed some aggression that tends to happen with some Van Dieman, so I'm probably just hyper aware for it.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. I prefer what we see here, where the shading is not as standout. I would probably be happiest with this ink if it was all this mid-muted, faded fire engine red that we see in most of it. But we do get to see some areas, like on the T where it's up and down together, it is a bit darker. It stands out against the quad rule with no kind of problem at all for me, making it great for use on quad rule paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no inky aggression. Perfect.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Diatramentis Document Red. Here is Noodler's Ascendant. Here is Private Reserve Fiesta Red. Here is Sailor Celebration Red.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely has any shading at all. I like this the most because it's really giving me the most of the tone of this red I prefer. If you're a student of mine using this in this notebook, I'm going to go ahead and bump you a whole letter just because of how great it looks. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, all smiles.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Gentle Blue Black. Here is Caran Dash Infinite Gray. Here is Sailor Studio 741. Here is Organic Studios John Hancock Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. And while that might be nice, it does not feather. And while that might be nice, it does not spread. And that is awesome. There is a bit of shading that you can see here, which isn't always something that I really care about on copy paper. More, the no spread, no feather is amazing. The fact that you still get to see some of the shading is an added bonus. This is looking like an amazing ink for copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, barely any spots that it gets deeper into the page. This is perfect as an ink and pen combination. If you use copy paper a lot and need to use a red, this would be a great distinctive red for you to be using.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The drier fine nib of the Jinhao 51A gives a sun-faded fire engine red that does shade, but doesn't tend to do it in a huge standout way. Now, off camera, I tried this in a very wet fine, and it darkened a bunch, very close to the swatch. It didn't shade anymore, but it was more aggressive. Both light and dark tones look good on the page. But for me, in this case, I go for the lighter tone from a dry fine or a dry medium. Just that sun-faded fire engine red really makes me smile.